What happens when your AI agent stops being just a tool and starts learning how you work? Not your documents or your customer records or your emails in the usual sense, right? I'm talking about, the pattern of you, what you escalate, what you ignore, and what kind of risk feels real to you, what kind of slide deck you trust, how you triage a messy inbox, or how you spot a weak vendor answer in 30 seconds. How you can tell when a team is drifting before the dashboard says anything is wrong. Once an enterprise agent starts learning that, who owns it? Because I think that question is going to matter a lot more than most companies realize. And I don't think most organizations are even close to ready for it. If you're a CISO or a privacy lawyer, an HR tech leader, or a enterprise architect, this issue sits right at the intersection of governance, of labor, privacy, and platform strategy. And the reason it matters is simple. For years, enterprises have argued about who owns the data, customer data, employee records, source code, internal documents. Those fights are familiar, but persistent AI systems introduce something different. They don't just store what happened. They can start building a working model of how particular people operate. And once that happens, the ownership question gets much harder because now you're no longer talking only about company records. You're talking about learned behavioral context. And that means, this is not just a security issue, not just a privacy issue, not just a policy issue. It's all of them at once. Here's what I want to do in this video. I want to separate behavioral memory from ordinary business records. I want to explain why employers will absolutely want to treat that memory as company property. I want to explain why that answer is too simple. Then I want to walk through portability, offboarding, and the kind of governance model I think enterprises should start building now before they stumble into this by accident, because that is how this kind of problem usually enters the enterprise, quietly through convenience. Now, one important caveat before we go further, right? Most enterprise AI systems on the market today are still pretty primitive on this front. They're much closer to session memory, saved preferences, and narrow workflow context than some rich model of a person's professional judgment. So I'm not saying that most companies fully have this today. I'm saying that the trajectory is visible now, and the governance questions are going to show up before most organizations are ready for them. So let's start here, because the whole discussion gets sloppy if we don't define things clearly. So when I say behavioral memory, I do not mean ordinary stored data. And I also don't mean that today's mainstream enterprise tools have already crossed into some fully mature version of this. In many cases, they haven't. But what I mean is that the direction of travel, like systems that move from simple context retention into a more durable understanding of how particular people work, that's where we're heading. So that distinction matters, because once a system starts learning patterns like escalation habits, review preferences, communication style, and decision thresholds, you're no longer talking about a neutral productivity feature in the ordinary sense. You're talking about the early form of a behavioral layer. Think about an executive assistant agent that has watched a leader for 9 months. It knows which meeting requests matter and which ones are noise. It knows which stakeholders get immediate answers and which ones can wait. It knows that short summaries work better than long memos for that person. Or it knows that a draft is not ready until the risks are grouped a certain way. It knows that looks fine from that executive really means I haven't read this carefully yet. That accumulated pattern is not the same thing as the raw emails or calendar items that, or chat logs, for example, that fed it. So the business records are one layer. The behavioral model built on top of them is another. And that distinction matters because privacy and governance rules often start with a deceptively simple question. What exactly are we processing? So under GDPR, profiling is broadly defined as automated processing of personal data used to evaluate or predict personal aspects, including things tied to performance, to preferences, reliability, behavior, work-related characteristics, and that sort of thing. That matters here because an enterprise AI agent that learns how you prioritize, how you respond, and decide may be operating much closer to profiling territory than a lot of teams want to admit. And that does not automatically mean every persistent enterprise agent is unlawful. It does mean that, it's just a productivity feature framing, gets weak pretty quickly. Because once the system is evaluating and adapting to individual work behavior, you're no longer talking about a neutral tool in any ordinary sense. You're talking about a system that's learning a person-shaped pattern from the way that person works. And I think a lot of governance models are still pretending that distinction doesn't exist. Now, to be fair, the employer side argument is not crazy. If the system learned from work performed inside company systems on company time against company problems using company infrastructure, the company's instinct will be very clear. This is ours. From the employer's point of view, that memory increases enterprise capability. It makes teams faster, it preserves institutional knowledge, it reduces ramp time. It helps maintain continuity when people are out, moved, or gone. It may improve training, delegation and workload balancing. It may even make promotions and staffing decisions look more evidence-driven. And that's exactly why companies will be tempted to claim broad ownership over it, because it looks useful, it looks expensive to recreate, and it looks like one more enterprise asset that good management should capture instead of letting walk out the door. If you're an operator, it's easy to see the appeal. Why wouldn't you want a system that remembers how your strongest people work? Why wouldn't you want some of that judgment preserved when someone leaves? Why wouldn't you want a successor to inherit part of that operational memory instead of starting from zero? That's the employer case. And honestly, it's not hard to make. But here's the problem. That logic works much better for ordinary work product than it does for learned behavioral patterns. A spreadsheet is not a person, right? A process document is not a person. A risk register is not a person. But a persistent system that has learned how a specific person judges quality, urgency, tone, and trade-offs is getting a lot closer to capturing part of what made that person valuable in the first place. And that's where the whole thing starts to feel less like records retention and more like extracting professional judgment into a company-owned memory layer. So this is the part that most people miss, right? The old ownership categories break down here because behavioral memory is mixed. Some of it is clearly enterprise linked. If the system learns internal approval routes, confidential decision criteria, customer risk signals, security workflows, or sensitive strategic context, that is obviously not something an employee should just take with them. But some of it looks a lot more like the worker's own accumulated operating style, how they structure decisions, how they triage ambiguity, how they communicate upward versus downward, how they evaluate weak reasoning, how they sequence work under pressure. That's not ordinary company property in the way that a shared drive folder is. And if enterprises treat the whole memory layer as purely corporate by default, they're going to run into at least three problems. The first is fairness, because the company is not just storing work outputs anymore. It's potentially retaining a model of how a person introduces leverage. The second is transparency. Would employees even understand the extent to which these systems are learning from them? The regulators like the ICO have been pretty clear in the workplace monitoring context that monitoring must be necessary, proportionate, and transparent. That doesn't resolve the ownership issue by itself, but it absolutely raises the bar for how casually employers should approach systems that infer patterns from worker behavior. And so then the third thing is power, right? Once the company can say, in effect, we know how effective you are because the system has modeled your work over time, the relationship changes. That can affect performance management, promotion logic, retention strategies, and even bargaining power. And the point here is not that every company will abuse this. The point is that the capability itself changes the structure of the relationship. That alone should make governance people sit up. So now we get to the hard question. Should employees be able to take some of that memory with them? I think the honest answer is partially, maybe, but only if enterprises stop pretending this is all one blob. Because full portability sounds clean until you ask what is actually inside the memory layer. If it contains internal financial context, for example, or sensitive customer data, security workflows, vendor-specific negotiation patterns, and confidential operation logic, then no, obviously that should not just walk out the door. But if part of the memory is really a reusable pattern of how someone thinks and works, then it becomes much harder to defend a regime where, the employee loses all of it the moment they leave. That is the portability fight I think is coming. Not can I export my chats, not can I download my files. Can a person retain some structured expression of how they work without taking the employer's protected information with them? That's a much harder technical and governance problem. And I think it's probably where serious architecture teams need to start pushing, because if you do not create some separation between enterprise content and learned behavioral abstraction, you're effectively choosing a future where all accumulated AI-assisted professional leverage defaults to the company or to the platform vendor. That might be convenient, it might even be profitable, but let's not pretend it's neutral. So this is where the abstract discussion turns operational. Think about your current joiner, mover, leaver process. Most organizations know how to disable accounts, recover devices, rotate credentials, reassign files, preserve records, and hand off responsibilities. Now add persistent AI agents to that process. What happens to the memory layer when a person leaves? Do you delete it? Do you archive it? Do you transfer it to the manager? Do you let a successor inherit part of it? Do you split the memory into enterprise retained context and worker linked behavior patterns? Every option has trade-offs. Delete everything and the organization may lose meaningful continuity and practical value. Keep everything and you may be retaining highly individualized behavioral intelligence long after the employment relationship ends. And you may be turning one person's learned work patterns into a reusable organizational asset without ever having clearly governed that transition. And this is why I think offboarding policy is one of the fastest ways to test whether a company has thought seriously about this issue. If your organization has no answer to what happens to persistent agent memory when someone exits, then it has not really governed persistent agents. It has adopted them. Those are different things. So NIST's AI RMF is useful here because it pushes organizations to govern, map context, measure risks, and manage responses across a lifecycle. That's not a legal ownership framework, but it's a strong reminder that AI systems should not be treated as drop-in productivity gadgets with no lifecycle discipline. Persistent enterprise memory is exactly the kind of thing that needs lifecycle discipline. So what would a better approach look like? I think it starts with classification. Not all memory is the same. Enterprises should separate at least 3 categories. So one would be enterprise records and protected business context. That includes customer information, strategic documents, security workflows, privileged internal logic, confidential operating details. Next would be system-generated operational context. So things like recurring workflow state, approved tool usage patterns, or non-personal procedural memory that helps the system function. And third, learned behavioral memory tied to individual workers. So this is the hardest category and it deserves its own treatment rather than being buried inside the first two. So from there, I'd want explicit policy decisions. What can the system learn? What can the company retain? What can be transferred internally? What, if anything, can be made portable for the worker in a controlled form? And then I would connect that to actual process. Joiner, mover, leaver controls, access governance, retention schedules, vacancy notices, review rights, escalation paths when a worker disputes how their behavioral data is being used. This is also where legal and HR need to stop treating this as someone else's problem. Security cannot solve it alone. Architecture cannot solve it alone. Procurement cannot solve it alone. If you don't align legal, HR, security, data governance, and architecture here, your policy will collapse under real-world edge cases almost immediately. Now, the obvious pushback is this. Aren't we overcomplicating a tool problem? Maybe. It's worth asking. Maybe some of this ends up looking more like glorified preference storage than a real model of professional judgment. Maybe enterprise overhype the capability and underuse it in practice. I think that's a fair caution. And I also think it misses the planning problem. You do not need the most dramatic version of this future for governance to matter. You just need systems that learn enough about worker behavior to become valuable, to become sticky and consequential. That threshold is much lower than full synthetic professional cloning. If an agent gets good enough to make one employee materially more effective than another, or good enough that losing its memory hurts role continuity, or good enough that managers start relying on its behavioral model in performance and staffing decisions, then this issue is already real. It does not need to be science fiction to become a governance problem. It just needs to become enterprise useful. And that is exactly the zone I think we're moving into. So here's where I land. I do not think enterprises should default to the position that all behavioral memory belongs entirely to the company. I also do not think that workers should be able to export everything that an agent learned in a raw, unrestricted form, obviously. I think the defensible middle ground is to treat persistent behavioral memory as a mixed governance asset that requires explicit policy, technical separation where possible, transparency to workers, and life cycle controls tied to retention, transfer. That's messier than a clean ownership claim, but messy is not the same thing as wrong. In fact, I think the clean answers here are the dangerous ones, because if companies quietly decide that everything the system learns about you, about how you work, is just company property now, then they're making a labor, privacy, and governance decision without admitting that's what they're doing. And if vendors end up defining those defaults for them, that's even worse. I think one of the biggest enterprise AI debates of the next few years will be framed badly at first. People will talk about productivity, about automation, better co-pilots, smarter workflows. Those things matter, but under that conversation is a deeper one. Who owns the learned memory of how people work? Because once enterprise AI systems start accumulating that kind of context, they're not just helping people do work, they're capturing patterns of judgment, preference, and behavior that sit uncomfortably close to professional identity. And if organizations wait until the first dispute, the first exit fight, the first privacy complaint, or the first ugly HR case to think about this, they will already be late. And this is a design question now, not later. So if you're building AI governance, I think this belongs on the table early, not after deployment, not after the first issue, early. Who owns the behavioral memory? What stays with the company? What, if anything, should stay with the worker? And what happens when someone leaves? If you want more content on enterprise AI governance, on risk, auditability, privacy, and platform control, subscribe. And if you've got a strong view on this one, put it in the comments, because I think this is exactly the kind of issue that sounds niche right up until it becomes unavoidable.